This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers, that is 2 or 3 page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 612, entitled, "What are feminazis and why do masculists hate them so much?" Description. This flyer explains what a feminazi is and why masculists have such a hatred of feminazis for their hypocritical, bigoted genocide. The flyer itself. What are feminazis and why do masculists hate them so much? Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. A feminazi is a particularly obnoxious type of feminist who hates men because she's been so brainwashed by feminist ideas on how men oppress women that she feels fully justified in hating men and thus feels free to express her hatred of men publicly, putting men down with misandrous comments, expressing a surly attitude towards men, etc. Nearly all men find feminazis a pain in the ass and choose not to have relationships with them. So typically feminazis live manless lives. They may hook up with the odd, rather brutish male for sex from time to time, not reflecting on their profound hypocrisy in this regard, that is, sexing with the enemy. Sexually choosing to sex with the very type of man she, as a feminist, despises. Masculists are like most men this way, but go much further in having powerful gender political and ethical reasons to hate feminazis, which this flyer presents. So, why do masculists have a hatred of feminazis? There are a lot of reasons why, which this flyer lists one by one. Probably the most powerful reason why masculists hate feminazis is that masculists see feminazis as hypocritical, bigoted genociders, wiping out whole populations. Masculists see feminism as a deeply misandrist, genocentric ideology that preaches how men oppress women but says nothing, in capital letters, in the reverse direction. Masculists don't deny that men oppress women, for example, rape, domestic violence, sexual harassment, etc. Masculists can read feminist books as readily as can feminists, so there are many masculists who are male feminists, in the sense that they see men's gender crimes against women as unethical. But the gender political bias of feminists, that is, that they see gender oppression as a one-way street, that is, that it is men who are the oppressors and women who are the oppressed, is seen by masculists as contemptible, cowardly, as women not taking responsibility for their own lives, etc. Masculists are typically bi-conscious, that is, they see gender oppression as very much a two-way street, and have learned from masculist ideas that women definitely oppress men too, TWO, and in fact worse than vice versa, since many of women's gender crimes against men are horrible and last decades, which makes them worse than the relatively minor ways that men oppress women. To masculists, even rape, which is one of the worst ways that men oppress women, is seen as rather small beer in comparison to the worst big three ways that women oppress men, namely women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, and women's forced fathering. Anyone who open-mindedly examines these three gender crimes that women commit against men becomes convinced how horrible they are and can understand why masculists have such a hatred against the gender criminal women who commit these horrible gender crimes against men. Masculists certainly have a hatred of fluffies who manslave men, divorce rape men, who force men into decades-long fathering to pay for kids men don't want, or worse, who are not even his. Masculists punish such women severely by effectively exterminating them, by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, so that these fluffy women rot on the shelf, punished by men, left manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and utterly rejected, spat at, and totally pariahed. Masculists have good reason to hate fluffies and aim to wipe them out, but have an even greater hatred against feminazis, since in most cases, feminazis are still fluffies, that is, they are fluffy feminists. The typical feminist today, that's in April 2023 as I write this, is monoconscious. That is, by definition, she knows nothing about masculism and how women oppress men, so she feels fully justified in hating men for the ways that men oppress women, which is what feminism teaches her. Feminism is profoundly gender politically biased, emphasizing how men oppress women, but saying nothing, in capital letters, about how women oppress men. This hypocrisy on the part of the monoconscious feminists makes masculists hate them. So masculists see feminazis as hypocrites, that is, they see feminists lashing out at men for the ways that men oppress women, but say nothing about how women oppress men. Second and later waves of feminism have been around for 6 decades now. So there has been plenty of time for feminist ideas to have spread through the whole culture. Second wave feminism started with Jewish intellectuals, for example, Betty Friedan, Bella Abzug, etc., in the 60s, which then spread to the universities, in women's consciousness raising groups, then to the journalists, then to the magazines, then to the mass media, then to the middle class, and finally to the lower classes who never read a book in their lives. So in Western countries in today's world, nearly all women have been influenced by feminist ideas and have adopted a rather surly, morally superior attitude towards men, backed up by feminist ideology that teaches young women that men are pigs, men are rapists, men are toxic, etc. Now along comes masculism, which preaches to men that gender oppression is very much a two-way street. Thanks to the internet, a movement of men has grown up, which spreads men's gender issues on the internet, so that today's millions, literally millions of men, often younger men, have been influenced by Masculist and MGTOW ideas. Most young men in Western countries today know how toxic the divorce courts are, taken over by the feminists in the 70s, who brought with them their unquestioned, unconscious attitudes and expectations of men. That is, seeing men as cash machines to pay for women to have babies. So when the divorce came, divorcing fathers were butchered in these courts, losing custody of their kids with 90% probability, losing his house, so the fluffy, career incompetent, non-fit ex-wife could raise her kids in it. He lost half his wealth and stuff to her, was forced to pay for his kids, whom he was barely allowed to see. And if his ex-wife was a real fluffy, in brackets, that is, a career incompetent traditional woman who expected a man to pay for her for decades of his life, close brackets, then he was forced to pay her alimony, thus manslaving him after the divorce the way he was before the divorce. Masculists are abolitionists, seeing fluffydom as man's slavery and man's slavery as slavery, and hence hated and a war issue. Masculists are at war against fluffies and fluffy feminists. Most feminazis are fluffy feminists and hence seen by masculists as hypocrites and closed-minded towards the idea that gender oppression is a two-way street. It's this closed-mindedness towards bi-consciousness that makes bi-conscious masculists see monoconscious feminazis as utter bigots. The hypocritical bigotry of feminazis is one of the main reasons for masculist hatred of them. An even bigger reason for masculist hatred of feminazis is that those feminazis who took over the divorce courts have now become indirect genociders, since they have made divorce so toxic for men that they've made marriage and paternity toxic for men. So in many countries now, 2/3 and more of young men refuse to marry and have kids. They have seen the divorce rape of their fathers, uncles, older male friends, and wipe their hands of this massive gender injustice committed by women against men, and choose to live the MGTOW, men going their own way, lifestyle, spending their money on themselves and ignoring fluffy women and paternity. They have the attitude, quote, "Fuck marriage, fuck paternity, I'll go my own way and spend my money on myself. Fluffies and fluffy feminists can rot on the shelf. They are hateful, manslaving, divorce-raping vermin." to me," end quote. These monoconscious fluffy feminists have caused the birth rate to plummet, thus indirectly wiping out whole populations. Hence Masculists see them as genociders who have to be stopped with bullets if necessary in a sex war. Things cannot continue as they are currently going, or we wipe ourselves out. So Masculists have a particular hatred against feminazis who control the divorce courts because they see them as genociders, and genocide is a war issue. Masculists see feminazis as the enemy. Masculists also see monoconscious feminazis as stupid, as being their own worst enemies, since feminazis pay a high price for their misandry, namely that 99.5% of women are heterosexual. So even the most rabid of a feminazi is still dependent on men for her sex, so is forced to confront her hypocrisy in sexing with the enemy, if she is to get any sexual passion at all. Bi-conscious Masculists see this situation as both stupid and unnecessary. Masculists preach to such monoconscious feminazi bigots that it's very much in these women's self-interest to learn some masculism so that they become bi-conscious. This bi-consciousing will cause them to see that gender oppression is a two-way street and that in fact women oppress men worse. This bi-consciousing will cause their monoconscious anger and hatred at men for the ways that men oppress women to be cancelled by a corresponding anger and hatred at women for the ways that women oppress men, and in fact worse than vice versa. Thus these former monoconscious feminazis will become much nicer to be with for men, much more approachable, and hence these former feminazis will be much more likely to have boyfriends and relationships, which will make them a lot happier than the typical monoconscious, misandrist, male-dumping feminazi cunt whom Masculists and men in general despise and have nothing to do with, forcing such women to rot on the shelf. Fortunately for Masculists, the internet is now spreading Masculist and MGTOW ideas rapidly across the planet, so that now in many countries, most young men are conscious of the dangers of marriage, of divorce rape, of man's slavery, of fluffy parasitism, of forced fathering, of paternity fraud, of false rape accusations, etc., and are having their masculist consciousnesses raised. So we are seeing now the same thing happening with men, that is men's consciousness raising, as happened with women in the late 60s with the feminist women's lib consciousness raising. These millions of feminists then moved on in the 70s to women fair, the gender laws. For example, equal pay for equal work, permission to enter the professions, the abortion right, take over the divorce courts, the setting up of women's rights committees in the parliaments, etc. Billions of women's lives were thus changed as a result. Masculists today are aiming to do the same for men by first raising the masculist consciousness of billions of men, then men fairing the gender laws, brackets, for example, legislation of the PARA, that's paternity rejection right, the OPTAB, OPTAB, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births to block paternity fraud, etc., so that men can be liberated from decades of man's slavery to women, the core idea of masculism. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man's Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 610 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. Ciao.